High Flyers, welcome to part 2 of Champion Racing Pigeon Breeding and Pairing Series. Let's not waste any time and dive right in. Breeding season, at a glance. September. Most fanciers start to evaluate their young birds from the past breeding season during September, which makes this a time of year that we especially enjoy in pigeon racing. Only now can we start to assess the quality of our previous year's pairings. This is an exciting time for both racing or show fanciers, when we find out if we bred that special bird or discovered a special pair. The thrill of the possibilities is what I believe keeps many of us in the sport and provides so much pleasure. I know that this is true for me, anyway. I'd like to share with you some thoughts on training and feeding. A few years back, I was speaking with a champion young bird fancier with several decades of experience, and what he shared with me was quite intriguing. He told me that he had been keeping detailed records on his young birds for many years, and he had developed a theory that his pigeons seemed to come into and go out of condition in cycles lasting 3 weeks. He described how he had monitored his top clock birds over the many years of his racing career, and with the exception of the occasional super champion, most of his pigeons seemed to take approximately 3 weeks of intense training to come into condition, remaining in condition for about 3 weeks, and giving good performances. The other part of the cycle was apparently that they would fall off for about 3 weeks before their results would again be outstanding. After that conversation with him, I have closely followed the results of not only my own teams of birds, but also those of the many fanciers that I have worked with over the years. Our findings seem to indicate a definite correlation with the 3-week rule. Many fanciers have birds that they fly week in and week out with outstanding results, but those birds are rare and are certainly the exceptions to the rule. The vast majority of our birds give 1 or 2 or perhaps 3 good performances, with less than stellar results for the rest of the racing season. I wonder about a way to monitor or assess top condition in our birds, perhaps by measuring the blood-oxygen ratio, through which we could determine before shipping them, if they are in optimum condition to give a top performance. Knowing this, we could strategize to save our best racers and rest them when their condition is not its best. We could know when the bird was at its very best and put the pedal to the metal, so to speak. I have personally never been a big fan of super hard training, and I have never regretted that approach to racing. Of course, everything is relative, and hard training in one area of the country might not be considered so hard in another, but I can attest to the following: in my line of work, I field questions from fanciers every day, and I'm glad to be able to say that in almost no case has this method of training and feeding young birds failed to produce winning results, from the smallest club level of competition to the biggest and most prestigious competitions in America. I'd like to offer some ideas for your consideration. Remember my earlier statement about our birds coming into form over a 3-week period and remaining in form for 3 weeks with the exception of the champion bird. I believe that a successful training regimen would look something like this. Start training at a distance that you think your young birds can handle without stressing them too hard. This way, if you have a team of birds that hasn't been flock flying around the loft very well, you have no reason to go out 2 miles. On the other hand, if your birds have been training around the loft very well, and you are sure that they have rooted from as far as 3 or more miles from home, you might consider starting your birds a little farther out. Personally, I don't think it matters much whether you start at 1 mile or 10 miles. I think what is important is that the birds feel comfortable and capable of handling the task you give them. I like to keep the pigeons' confidence up, because confident pigeons race faster than those that are having second thoughts as to where they actually are. By training often, every day, but not necessarily so very far, I think that you can accomplish getting the birds' confidence up. Naturally, I also take the birds to longer distances, but to this date, I have never taken my birds to the first race station prior to a race, and although we, meaning myself and those that I help, compete against many who do, we've never seemed to lose very much ground to those guys who train super hard prior to the season. Keep in mind the 3-week rule. Of course, if you have a large number of birds, and you work them very hard very early, you're in a better situation at the beginning of racing season to send only the better birds to the most important races, just as long as those birds have been given some time to get their wings back under them. I don't have the time or the room to have a very large team of birds, and most people that I have helped don't either, so I prefer to train the birds in a gradual way so that for the most important races on the schedule, I have birds that are capable of competing well in them. And I haven't had to take a loan at the bank to pay for the fuel and a new set of tires on my truck. Another tidbit I'll throw out is this: I'm not a great fan of tossing the birds in small groups, unless I have someone at home who can feed the birds the proper amount as they arrive and not let them overeat. We all read about this or that champion fancier who trains his pigeons in small groups so that they learn how to separate from the flock, and develop more confidence flying in smaller groups, rather than becoming accustomed to flying in a large flock. I agree with the premise of this idea, but I also know that every fancier trains under very different circumstances, and we must all consider every aspect of our training regimen before we take a particular course of action. Last racing season a friend told me that he was having trouble with his young bird team. They were sluggish, wouldn't fly well around the loft, and he was having trouble getting them online with the training. He thought that the birds were sick. I asked him to detail his regimen, and he told me that he was taking the birds out every morning for training, and either he or his training partner was letting the birds out one basket at a time. This meant that the birds were being released about 15 at a time up to 20 minutes apart. From the first to the last basket there was often an almost 2-hour time differential. I asked him who was at home when the birds arrived. He told me, no one. When he trained the birds himself, he had barely enough time to let the birds go and get to work, and when his buddy trained for him, he was always at work when the birds eventually arrived. After thinking about it for a second, I told him this: your birds are not sick, and they aren't stupid, but they are being fed in a very improper way. He balked at that, saying that he fed the best mixture that he could afford. I told him that it wasn't the mixture itself, but the way in which the birds were getting the mixture that was the problem. The first 2 groups of birds being released on his tosses were coming home and taking their pick of what was in the feeders. All the others were having to make do with what was left, if anything was left. He confessed to me that he was really loading the feeders down with feed so that he could make sure that the later arrivals had something waiting for them. I told him to immediately stop training his birds in small groups and start letting the entire flock up at one time. I also told him to measure the amount of feed that the birds were cleaning up within 10 or 12 minutes after he fed. That would be his base amount of feed. I then told him to put that measured amount of feed in the feeders and let the entire flock fly home to that amount of feed every day. Within a week, with no medication, his birds began doing much better. By the time the races started, his birds were flying like gangbusters. He ended up winning 10 of the 14 races that season. Were his birds sick? No. Was it so necessary for him to train the birds in small groups? In his case, certainly not. He had no one there to keep the early arrivals from overeating at the later arrivals' expense. Once all of his birds got on the same feeding schedule, the entire flock benefited. For those of you who work during the daytime and don't have anyone at home to separate the arrivals, or feed them as they come in, I recommend that you forget all the fancy small flock tosses. Leave that to those who have all day to train, and have the assistance of a group of helpers. About all that they will gain on you will be a couple of short early races, because once your flock has had a few races under its belt, your birds will be on the same page as the others, and the quality of the pigeon will be the ultimate determining factor in whose birds are winners on race day. And that's it for part 2 of racing pigeon breeding and pairing. Stay tuned for part 2 where we will continue with breeding season. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. Your free downloads are below. Thank you.